just because I can't get rid of it if you have it sitting there and it seems to go through all the slides. So I don't know why that's possible, but it's probably something with Zoom, I guess. At any rate, so here what we're looking at is just by way of reminder and review, we're looking at the connection between the hypothalamus, that's this upper area here, and the stalk, the communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Where it's a vascular communication, it's going to communicate with the anterior pituitary lobe of the pituitary gland. If it is a nervous communication, then it looks a little bit more like this, where we have long axons, and stored at the ends of these axons are the hormones associated with the posterior pituitary gland. So what's important to remember here is that the posterior pituitary gland stores two hormones, but does not produce them, where the anterior pituitary gland actually produces hormones. So the two hormones that we see, let's see, are going to be oxytocin and ADH. And we'll talk a little bit about those a little bit later today, but those are stored in the posterior pituitary gland, but they're produced up here in these neurosecretory hormones, or sorry, neurons in the hypothalamus. Okay, so let me get this thing up top. And we go back to the anterior pituitary gland. These cells up here in the top, they produce releasing or inhibiting hormones and put them into the circulation to communicate with the cells in the anterior pituitary gland. And remember, the anterior pituitary gland then produced 6 main groups of hormones. It produced ACTH, which we're going to talk more about today, TSH, which we talked about last week, FSH, LH. Those two as a group are referred to as gonadotropins because they target the gonads. In females, that's the ovary, and in males, that's the testes. And we have prolactin, and we have growth hormone. So we've talked about growth hormone, and we've talked about TSH in the pathways. We've said all we're going to talk about with FSH and LH for this course, because the main thing to remember about those is that they're going to target the male and female gonads and stimulate the process of ovum maturation, the egg for the female, and the testosterone for the male. So that the testosterone then contributes to what we call spermatogenesis. So the two processes that FSH and LH regulate are some hormone production. In females, it's about estrogen, and to some degree progesterone. And in males, it's testosterone. And then the processes are called oogenesis for females, production of an egg, and spermatogenesis in males, production of sperm. That's all we need to know for FSH and LH in this course. Okay, prolactin, I think we talked about prolactin, but it targets breast tissue in a lactating female to promote milk production. And that's important to remember, that we're saying milk production, because later on when we talk about oxytocin, we'll see that it's involved with milk delivery. So what we call ejection, not production. There's a difference. So you want to keep in mind the difference between the two. Okay, so I think last week we were talking about the growth hormone. And in the growth hormone, we looked at the link between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And remember, we said that we would have growth hormone, releasing hormone, that would stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to produce and release growth hormone. It targets the liver to promote things like gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. This is all from last week. And that's going to increase blood glucose supply, in other words, raise the blood glucose levels. But in addition to that, we know that growth hormone promotes protein synthesis on almost every cell in the body. So it's anabolic in that respect to protein, but catabolic to lipids. So the fat cell is going to get broken down, or the triglycerides stored in the fat cells gets broken down so that the fatty acids can be used by the liver to make glucose. And that was that process called gluconeogenesis. So this is just a visual that shows us some of that stuff that's going on here. I don't know if anybody had the assignment, used ghrelin as an assignment topic, but we're not worried about that for the purposes of our course here, but it plays a role on all of this as well. It's a hormone that gets released from the stomach, but we're not responsible for that for this course. So we did get talking about this at the end of last week. This is where we kind of finished off. So again, we have our hypothalamic, pituitary, in this case, thyroid axis. Hypothalamus releases TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Sometimes it's just called thyrotropin. You don't have to, it's almost a bit redundant to add the releasing hormone part to it. Targets the anterior pituitary gland. Anterior releases TSH, and TSH targets the thyroid gland, makes the thyroid gland grow, and promotes the formation of the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. And who remembers what the 3 and the 4 refer to? Nobody can tell me what the 3 and the 4 are in reference to?
Those are the hormones
I hear more feedback, more white noise than I hear voices. I know somebody was talking, but I could not tell anything because the noise in the background is huge. Go ahead.
Sorry, is it triiodothyronine?
Yeah, but what's the 3 and the 4 refer to?
Does it refer to a
The
thyroid?
amount of molecules. One has 3, one has 4 iodines.
It is iodine, since I just wrote it down. Yes,
Oh, I didn't see that.
it refers to the iodine molecules. In triiodo tells you there's 3 iodines right in the name. I'm not asking you to memorize that name because I'll put T3 or triiodothyronine together. And T4 is sometimes just called thyroxine, and it's got an extra iodine molecule in it. So these numbers are there for a purpose. And since we've talked about it, you would be responsible for that. It's not a big ask. Remember what the 3 and the 4 are referring to. So these as a group represent the thyroid hormones. And as we talked about last week, they target almost all the tissues in the body. There's just a very few exceptions. And when they target those tissues, the net result is an increase in basal metabolic rates. We increased our BMR. And the main reason we did that was because we increased oxygen uptake by most cells. And if we increase oxygen uptake, what does that mean we can make more of?
ATP.
That's right. So we make more ATP, and if we make more ATP, we have more energy available for all the various metabolic actions that occur in the body. So if a cell makes proteins, it can make more. If a cell makes some form of a lipid, it can make more. And if we use more ATP, then we get this, and we get our energy. And when we get energy and use it, what do we also create?
Heat.
That's right, heat. So the other function that we think of when we think about these thyroid hormones is that they can increase body temperature. So they become part of thermoregulation. Remember, the regulatory centers for body temperature are up in the hypothalamus. So we're not very far away from the hypothalamus in our pathways here. So if the hypothalamus, it might be stimulated to initiate this pathway we're looking at, if the body temperature is dropping. We could be stimulated to initiate this pathway if our blood glucose levels were down. Or these are very important hormones for normal growth and development, and we need lots of ATP for normal growth and development. So there's all these possible stimuli that will result in this pathway that we're looking at: hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, thyroid gland. And I think let's see here if I can. Yep. So then I think we finished last week just mentioning some of the other cells in the thyroid gland. So here's a picture of our thyroid gland. We're looking at the thyroid gland. Remember, it was anterior neck, cervical area, anterior, and it's two distinct lobes with a little bridge in between. Okay, and the most of those cells we called were follicular cells. And they were responsible for making T3 and T4. And then we had some parafollicular cells. And they were responsible, anybody remember what they're responsible for?
Parathyroid hormone.
Nope, the other one.
Calcitonin.
Calcium.
Okay, and we do have the parathyroid hormone to consider here, but for the cells that are related to the thyroid gland specifically, we're looking at these two groups of cells, and we know that calcitonin decreased blood calcium levels, right? Its name actually tells you it's going to tone calcium, so it's going to bring it down. Some additional cells separate from the thyroid gland, but attached to the thyroid gland, and they're illustrated here. There's typically small groups or clusters of different cells that that represent what we call the parathyroid gland. They're really sets of cells in two to four pairs of clusters on sort of the back side of the thyroid gland. So they produce a different hormone. They produced the parathyroid hormone, and the parathyroid hormone we described as basically being antagonistic to calcitonin. If it's antagonistic to calcitonin, it means we're going to be able to raise blood calcium levels when we activate parathyroid. So those two hormones are going to be sensitive to the concentration levels of blood calcium. If blood calcium starts to drop, then the parathyroid hormone is going to be more active. If blood calcium levels start to rise too close to the upper limit, then calcitonin gets released. So we can see here that rising plasma calcium, which is another way of saying blood calcium, stimulates calcitonin. And calcitonin will lower blood calcium levels by targeting skeletal tissue and having osteoblast activity overpower osteoclast activity. Therefore, there's more storage of calcium. We're okay with that, right?
Yes.
And at the kidneys, if we're trying to lower blood calcium, we're going to have the kidneys excrete more calcium. So we'll eliminate it from the body altogether. So both of those things work together to lower the blood calcium levels. Parathyroid is going to do just the opposite. Its goal is to raise blood calcium. So we're going to mobilize minerals from bone, and that would be through what cell? What cell would help us mobilize calcium from bone?
Osteoclast.
That's right. That's right. So we would get an increase in osteoclast activity. And it's always a balance between the blasts and the clasts. So it's really about the relationship between the two. When calcitonin is dominant, the blasts outperform the clasts. And when parathyroid is dominant, the clasts will outperform the blasts. It's a relative thing, which is really what homeostasis is all about. Constantly ebbing and flowing, constantly flowing between upper and lower limits. And if we're trying to increase blood calcium levels at the kidney, will promote reabsorption. And the third target for the parathyroid hormone is the digestive system. So in the presence of vitamin D, we can absorb more calcium from our diet. So 3 ways to get our calcium levels up. Right, so I think that's where we finished last week, right? That's where we kind of finished talking. We got that far?
Yes.
So what we want to do today is carry on with that relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland with the hormones we haven't yet talked about. Let's see here. We got that one. So we're not going to talk about that. So did we do anything here for that writing that? So we can draw in our boxes. Hypothalamus. To the anterior pituitary gland. And this time, we're going to be targeting another gland called the adrenal gland. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So from the hypothalamus, under the right stimulus, so we have to have a stimulus. And that stimulus might be, it can be low blood glucose. For example, it could be stress. It could be, well, we'll leave it at stress, but stress is stress really can be a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing. So any kind of stressor will stimulate this pathway. And that stressor might be the requirement for repair after an injury, for example. That would be categorized as a stress. Even growth, arguably, is categorized as a stress. It's a good stress, but it's still a stress. So when we look at the pathway from the hypothalamus, these types of stimuli will be registered by the hypothalamus, and it's going to release a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone. So CRH is cortico. And that stimulates the cells in the anterior pituitary gland to produce and releases a hormone called ACTH. Adrenal, and that fits because we see the adrenal gland over here. Cortical, so it tells us what part of the adrenal gland, and tells us it's going to promote activity by being trophic, and it's a hormone. So that's ACTH, adrenal cortical trophic hormone. You might see it called just adrenal corticotropin, but that doesn't account for all the letters in the abbreviation, and this way it does. And when we target the adrenal gland directly, we're going to see that we're going to release a hormone called cortisol. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But if ACTH is elevated, or particularly cortisol as well, elevated, because that's the responsibility, then we're going to have negative feedback. And what we get in negative feedback is the release of corticotropin inhibiting hormone or inhibiting factor. And that will slow down. So if we follow the yellow increases everything. Right? And you follow me with this. This is how we get yellow would be up and green would be down. Right? And we have homeostasis. If you follow that when I put the green and the yellow in there, okay?
Yes.
Okay, so this is sort of a dynamic picture, right? If you go back and look at this later and you see arrows going up and down, you're going to say, ooh, what the heck is going on here? So you follow the yellow pathway first and then recognize that the dashed lines are negative feedback, which will trigger the green pathway, right? And then the green pathway, you follow it through, that will initiate negative feedback that results in the yellow pathway. And we're going to go through that all day long. Now, ACTH, like we talked about with growth hormone, has its own sort of circadian rhythm, in other words, its own sort of 24-hour cycle, but also will be increased with stimuli like what we've shown to trigger this in the first place, like low blood glucose. So we already know one of the results of this cortisol. We know that one thing cortisol is going to do is raise blood glucose, and it's also going to address stress. We'll talk about how it does that in just a minute and what it does in order to do that. But we're okay with this pathway?
Yeah.
So this adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. So anything to do with the kidney, the Greek word for kidney is renal, or pertaining to the kidney has to do with renal. So this is a gland that sits on the kidney. So it's ad kidney, on the kidney. And the adrenal gland is very, very vascular, and that makes sense. If it's going to be an endocrine gland, it makes sense that it would be vascular because it has to be able to deliver the hormones into the circulation to reach their targets. So when we look at the adrenal gland, if we just make the adrenal gland a little bigger over here, we would see that there's this inner zone, and that's called the medulla. So this is the adrenal medulla, and that's why it's important when we're talking about the brain, and we're talking about that part of the brainstem that's called the medulla oblongata. It's important that we remember to put that word oblongata after medulla, because there's more than one medulla. And the cortex is the outer part. So this outer part is the cortex, and it's got three distinct zones. So we're going to make one zone separate from another one. Whoops. So this outermost zone is made up of a group of hormones that are called the mineral corticoids. And I know there's a couple of people that are listening that have been through this. We talked a little bit about this last week with the AA group on Friday. So the mineral corticoids, they're responsible for influencing what? Well, if you look at their name, especially the very first part of their name, what do you think they might have something to do with?
Minerals.
Yeah, minerals. And specifically, we'll see in a few minutes when we start to talk about it, it's going to be sodium. And we already know that sodium is kind of paired with another electrolyte or another mineral that typically goes in the opposite direction to sodium. Which one was that?
Is it chloride?
Potassium.
Oh, potassium, yes.
It's potassium for the positive charge, but chloride ions typically will go the same direction as sodium, trying to maintain electricity balance that way. And that's why potassium, another positively charged one, typically moves in the opposite direction. So both cases, it's about trying to maintain an equilibrium between electric charges. So if you move a positive in, we'll bring a negative one to neutralize it. But if more sodium comes into that, then we're going to have to exchange it with another positive ion, which is our sodium-potassium pump, right? Sodium, potassium, matched up. So mineral corticoids we're going to see in a little few minutes. They're going to influence sodium, chloride, and potassium. And we're going to see that that will have an influence on water, and we'll talk about that. So the middle zone is made up of a group of hormones that are called glucocorticoids. So you look at that name and you say, what's it likely to have something to do with?
Glucose.
Yeah. That doesn't take a big stretch, right, to figure out that they must have something to do with glucose. So they're going to influence glucose. And those are the ones we want to talk about when we talk about cortisol. This innermost zone, the innermost zone here, they're made up of a group of hormones that are called the androgens. And androgens tend to be anabolic. They are anabolic, they promote growth and development. They're not as strong at promoting growth and development as the big three. The big three are growth hormone, the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, and insulin. We haven't talked about insulin yet. But they promote especially secondary sex characteristics like hair growth and that sort of thing, a beard in a man and axillary hair and pubic hair in men and women, that sort of thing. So those are, and all three of these groups are steroid-based hormones. So if they're steroid-based hormones, they don't need to use the second messenger system. So that's their mechanism of action will be able to cross their targets' plasma membranes freely without the need of a second messenger. In the medulla, we produce the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, we've heard of those ones before, right? But when we talked about them before, what did we talk about them as?
Neurotransmitters.
Exactly. So they were neurotransmitters, but they're the same structural messenger. In this case, they're being produced by cells in the adrenal cortex and released into the circulatory system, but they'll target all the same tissues that the neurotransmitter epinephrine or epinephrine do. So you know already what this hormone's going to do. It's going to increase heart rate and force of contraction. It's going to increase respiration rates and airway diameter. It's going to mobilize glucose from the liver, gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. It's going to cause pupil dilation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that chart we made last week on the autonomic nervous system, when we looked at the sympathetic division, the neurotransmitter was epinephrine, norepinephrine. Now we're looking at hormones, same messenger, same targets. But we know from our definition of hormones, they arrive a little bit later, but last a lot longer. So these hormones will be responsible for sustaining or supporting or lengthening your fight or flight response. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so when we look at this pathway, we specifically see that this pathway with ACTH from the pituitary particularly targets cortisol. And cortisol is the largest of the glucocorticoids. You may also see it called cortisol. If it ends in O-N-E like that, that's your hint that it's a steroid-based hormone. And that just helps us with our mechanism of action on the target cell, right? So when we look at cortisol, one of the things we know about cortisol right off the bat, because of the way we've been talking about it, is we know it's going to raise blood glucose levels. So when we look at that pathway between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland and the adrenal gland, we know that each of the hormones in that pathway, CRH and ACTH, and cortisol all raise blood glucose. Look, our stimulus was low blood glucose. So one of the goals of this system is going to be to raise blood glucose levels. So another hormone that raises blood glucose, remember we said T3, T4 raise blood glucose. Growth hormone raises blood glucose. So the hormones that go backwards that support those pathways will all be other examples of hormones that raise blood glucose. We haven't talked about any that lower blood glucose yet. So we know cortisol is going to raise blood glucose levels, that's for sure. So the corticosteroids in total include mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and the androgens. And we're talking right now about the glucocorticoids. And in particular, we're talking about cortisol. So they're going to this is sometimes nicknamed the stress hormone. So if you don't have enough of this, you're not going to be able to respond physiologically as well to stress. So that's an important thing just to keep in the back of your mind. The stress hormone description doesn't provide much of a description, but it's a reminder for us to help us know what. So during stress, what do we want to make sure we can make a lot of?
Cortisol.
Well, yes. Cortisol is going to get released as our stress hormone. And what do we need a lot of during a stress response?
Oh, we're gonna produce a lot of glucose, release a lot of glucose.
For what reason?
Uh,
Come on.
ATP.
yeah,
ATP.
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 Because we need a lot of ATP. Right? You've heard me say this on many, many, many times. You breathe for oxygen, and you want the oxygen in order to make lots of ATP. Because without oxygen, we can't get glucose as pyruvate into the mitochondria, and that's where we need to make lots of ATP. You eat for glucose, and that's for the same reason, ATP. We don't have glucose, we don't have the easiest way, in other words, most efficient way to make ATP. We can make it from other pathways, that's what gluconeogenesis is, but it requires more work, which means we need more ATP to make it. Okay, so during stress of any type, we need a lot of ATP. So this hormone, we know then, is going to have some sort of influence on the production of ATP. And that main influence is going to be by increasing blood glucose concentrations in the blood. So our stimulus could be an acute stress and would probably recruit the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. We expect that. And when the sympathetic nervous system is active, it targets the adrenal gland. And one of the targets is the adrenal medulla, which we just showed you on the previous slide, to promote an increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine, but we're also going to increase the production of cortisol. So low blood glucose or stress is the major stimulus. And when we increase the glucocorticoids, we're going to get this increase in blood glucose because we increase gluconeogenesis. From amino acids and some fatty acids. In order to get the amino acids, we promote protein breakdown. So with the release of this elevated levels of cortisol, we target tissues that are high in proteins, especially in bones and muscle tissue. So if we have cortisol circulating for prolonged periods of time, we're going to see the bones get osteoporotic or atrophy, wasting away. Muscle tissue gets wasted away because we're going to mobilize amino acids from those tissues and make those tissues weaker. So prolonged stress becomes a problem for us. In short term, it's not a problem, but in long term, it becomes a problem. So when we increase gluconeogenesis from amino acids and fatty acids, we're going to increase some lipolysis. So same idea, okay, but from adipose tissue, right? We know that's where most of that. Okay. But the other thing that's associated with cortisol is that it is a negative influence on our immune system. So chronic stress, we know, can make us sick, and this is the mechanism behind it. When cortisol is elevated, it dampens or interferes with immune responses. It will interfere with the ability of the cells of the immune system to be as active. They're not as responsive or as vigilant, so the viruses and bacteria can kind of get past them easier. So it decreases white blood cell function, and the white blood cells are all about immunity. It decreases inflammation. In other words, cortisol is an anti-inflammatory, and some of you may be aware that cortisone can be used as a medication. And when cortisone is used as a medication, it's primarily used as an anti-inflammatory. You can take an injection or rub a cream that's based with cortisone, and use it as an anti-inflammatory. It also can be effective in people, for example, that have organ transplants or have some sort of autoimmune condition, because when it interferes with the immune system, that will make your organ transplant more acceptable, and it will reduce the symptoms of an autoimmune disease. So you'll see that cortisone therapies are applied to some of our autoimmune diseases, like rheumatoid arthritis, for example. And this is the mechanism behind why it can work, why it can be helpful. So the gluconeogenesis spares, right? We've used that term before, spares the glucose that might otherwise be circulating, so that, for example, the central nervous system can use the glucose that's already circulating in the stress response. So we can make glucose from some of the more complicated pathways, gluconeogenesis, and spare the free glucose, the glucose that came from our diet, to be used on a more emergency type basis instead. So again, cortisol raises blood glucose levels. We okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see now, where are we here? There's there. That's not the one we want to look at just yet. That's calcium. Here's our ACTH pathway, and that's how we get the cortisol. So here we have our hypothalamus responding to a stressor of some sort. The hypothalamus responds to levels of cortisol. That's that red line is just, that's referring to negative feedback. This would be our negative feedback over here. And our positive feedback, or at least our stimulus, would be low glucose or stress measured by the hypothalamus. Remember, hypothalamus was autonomic, fight or flight, versus rest and digest. If the fight or flight pathway is being called on, then we're going to get the release of our corticotropin releasing hormone, target the anterior pituitary gland. to release ACTH that targets the adrenal gland to release cortisol. Right? We happy with our pathway?
Yes.
Okay, so when we're looking at this adrenal gland, though, we have these other hormones. We have the mineral. So the glucocorticoids we've talked about now. So the main pathway was corticotropin releasing hormone, ACTH, and then we got cortisol release. Right? We know that we're in the hypothalamus, we're in the anterior pituitary gland, we're in the adrenal gland. Glucocorticoids. The mineral corticoids are mostly made up from a hormone called aldosterone. Now you see the way that that is ending in E-R-O-N-E. So if it's ending in O-N-E, you know it's steroid based, so you know its mechanism of action can act directly on a target cell. Now aldosterone, being a mineralocorticoid, is going to primarily promote an increase in sodium concentration in the blood. If we increase sodium concentration, one of the rules of physiology is if you add a solute into a solution to the point where the osmolarity concentration gets greater, then water is going to follow. So not only are we going to see that the sodium in the blood goes up, but we're also going to see an increase in the water. So the action is on sodium, but water follows. So that's the way we sort of remember the terminology. Water's going to follow the solute. So if we significantly increase sodium in the blood, then by definition, in the interest of equilibrium, homeostasis, water is going to follow. Now, if we increase the solute and we increase the water to the blood, what do you think is going to happen to blood volume in total?
It would increase.
Yeah. So that, and really that's saying the same thing as blood pressure. So this is a pathway that will increase blood pressure. So a stimulus could be low sodium or low water. Well, no, let's take that out. We don't want that to just confuse us a little bit. You'll see why in a little bit. Or low blood pressure. It will stimulate the mineralocorticoid pathway. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but we know generally, and we've mentioned this much before, that should be a mineralocorticoid, that the kidneys are responsible for filtering the blood. So the kidneys are going to be sensitive to low sodium and or low pressure. So the location for where these stimuli are going to get a response, in other words, the receptors, and if it's for sodium, they're called osmoreceptors. And if it's for pressure, they're called baroreceptors. So those receptors are located in the kidney. And if those receptors get excited, they're going to release something called, so we're going to say in the interest of low sodium and low blood pressure, receptors signal now this technically, this renin that I've written down in the green color is technically a hormone because it's being produced by these cells in the kidney and it's going to act somewhere else. We'll see just in a second where. So receptors, I'll just put in the kidney. signal the release of this protein called renin. And you have to be careful about your spelling because there's another renin that is circulating around that has a double N in the middle. Okay, so you just have to make sure you remember this is just single N's. Sounds exactly like it's spelled, but with no extra N's anywhere. Renin. Okay, so what renin is going to do is going to come across a protein that circulates in the blood that minds its own business, doesn't do anything unless it meets up with renin. And that protein is called angiotensinogen. Now that's a long word, but the OGEN on the end is a clue. This is something that's not yet active. When you see OGEN on the end of a word, it's a little bit like way back when we talked about pre-vitamin D. Pre-vitamin D is not active. Vitamin D is active. But angiotensinogen is not active unless it comes in contact with renin. And then renin stimulates a change, a structural change in angiotensinogen, converts it to something called angiotensin 1. Now, you already know something about angiotensin 1, and that is that there must also be what?
A second one.
2.
Angiotensin
Yeah,
2.
there's at least a 2, right? Because we named that one 1. We're not going to do that if it's the only one. So we'll come back to angiotensin 2 in just a second. So it was the combination of renin and angiotensinogen that gave us angiotensin 1. And look at that name for just a second, because angio tells us it has something to do with blood vessels. You wouldn't necessarily know that, but that's a root for blood vessels. When you see, for example, angiogenesis, that's a word that means we're going to make some new blood vessels. And if we see tensin on it, that's a little bit like tonin for calcitonin. Tensin means we're going to put some tension on it. So we're going to see that these words have something to do with constricting blood vessels, putting tension on blood vessels. So we first look at that and go, that means nothing to me, but there is some basis to the terminology once you get a little more familiar with it. So we got angiotensin 1 converted to angiotensin 2 by a very special enzyme. And that enzyme is abbreviated as ACE. Now, what do you think ACE is an abbreviation for? Angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. There's a whole category of medications that are designed to try to regulate blood pressure called ACE inhibitors. And ACE inhibitors are designed to block this pathway right here. Because what we're going to see when we look at angiotensin 2 is that it does two main things. It increases the production of aldosterone. And it increases vasoconstriction of most blood vessels. Now, if we're going to increase aldosterone, and we know that aldosterone increases sodium concentration, and water will follow, and we know those two things increase blood pressure. What did we say started all of this? A decrease in blood pressure. Stimulated renin to combine with angiotensinogen, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, increased aldosterone. Boom, we get more sodium, we get more water, we get more blood pressure. And on top of that, we vasoconstrict blood vessels. If we vasoconstrict blood vessels, we also increase blood pressure. So we've done two things to fix the stimulus, to reverse the stimulus, to negatively feedback on that stimulus. Does that make sense?
Sir, I had a question about the decrease of sodium.
The decrease up here?
Yeah, does that one stimulate decrease of blood pressure? Is that what you're writing there?
So that I put stimulus can be either a decrease in sodium in the blood or a decrease in blood pressure.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now here's the thing. If you have a decrease in sodium in the blood, you're also going to have a decrease in blood pressure,
All
right?
right.
Because if sodium leaves the blood, the water will follow sodium, and so the pressure will go down. But you can have lowering blood pressure for other reasons than just decreased sodium. So decreased sodium means there'll be a decrease in blood pressure, but not the only reason for a decrease in blood pressure.
Okay, thank you.
Does that work? Everybody okay with that? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So in either case, we've corrected both of those things. And our goal really from an emergency point of view, we're more concerned probably about blood pressure in the short term than the sodium. We can deal with the sodium because we've got some stored forms of sodium and some other ways to deal with it. But blood pressure needs to be fixed. And we're going to see that at the kidneys, that's where these changes occur. So this increase in sodium, okay, that the word we put on the other side here is reabsorption. So that's happening at the kidneys. Remember, we started by saying the kidneys filter the blood. So if they first notice that there's a decrease in sodium or a decrease in blood pressure, they're going to initiate these steps. And then the correction is actually in the kidney as well. So this reabsorption is occurring in the kidney. Kidney measures the sodium, sodium's low. So it's going to make sure that the sodium that is filtered out all goes back, reabsorption. And if the sodium is going back, water follows. So we fix the problem. We have sodium channels in the kidney tubules that will promote reabsorption when exposed to aldosterone. We okay with that?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, we're good. Okay. So this pathway is called the RAAS, the renin angiotensin or angiotensinogen aldosterone system. So when you see those letters, that's what it's referring to, this pathway we've just drawn out here. Okay, so it does, I recognize that it looks a little bit complicated. It's really just a series of steps, sometimes called a cascade, when we follow the steps along like that. But that's really what physiology is. We've got a trigger, which was our decrease in sodium or a decrease in blood pressure, that stimulates the release of renin, that then combines with angiotensinogen to become angiotensin 1. In the presence of ACE, an enzyme that's produced up by cells in the lungs, we get angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 is a major target, or it has a major target of most blood vessels. In other words, there's angiotensin 2 receptors on most blood vessels that are going to vasoconstrict. And it also targets the adrenal gland to promote the production and the release of aldosterone. And when aldosterone gets released, it does those things up there. And when we get those things in combination with this, we get our big increase in blood pressure, which is our negative feedback to what stimulated the whole thing in the first place. Does that work okay for everybody? Yeah, we're okay with that, or do we need to, we can go over it again.
Sir, can you go over it one more time?
Yep.
Yeah, one more time, please.
We'll put on a brand new thing. And what we'll do is we will, let's see, what's our best way to, here, we'll go kidney. So we'll put our kidney in here, and heading into the kidney for filtering is our blood. Okay, and what we notice is that in the blood, it's very low in sodium or it's low in blood pressure. Okay, so the kidneys are going to get excited about that, and they're going to release renin. And renin,
Question, so,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt. So the blood would be the stimuli.
Not the blood, but the low sodium and low
Yeah.
blood. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so what we can even go, so this represents our stimulus. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going to happen now is angiotensinogen remember, if it's in OGNE, it doesn't do anything. It's just a protein that circulates around. And next semester, when you do the circulatory system, you'll talk about what role it does play, even just as a protein, but it isn't an active chemical at this point until it comes in contact with renin. And then renin plus angiotensinogen are going to form angiotensin 1. And that has to go through another step to become angiotensin 2. And it uses an enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, angiotensin 2 increases vasoconstriction of most blood vessels, therefore will increase blood pressure. Okay. Now I'm going to put the adrenal glands here. Now, technically, I should have put it on top, right? Because it's adrenal. This, if by position, this is subrenal. But the gland is called adrenal. It's actually on top, but we're okay. I just want to put it back close to the kidney. We're okay with that?
Yeah, so it's under the kidney.
It's not under the kidney. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's called the adrenal gland, so it's actually on top of the kidney. The reason I didn't want to put it on top of the kidney is it's going to make a mess of the lines, and it's just going to make, but I better do it because somebody's going to say I said it was underneath. So the two things that angiotensin does is it increases vasoconstriction and it targets the adrenal gland to stimulate the adrenal gland to produce more aldosterone. And aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. And that means water follows. So when we say reabsorption, it means we're going back to the blood volume. And if we add sodium and water to the blood volume, then our blood pressure is going up. We okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, so that's same thing we said on that other page, but maybe this visual is just a little bit better for us following everything that's going on. Does that work?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so what that means now is what we've covered is our pathway between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. We said the anterior pituitary gland would produce growth hormone, ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, and prolactin. And these two were known as gonadotrophins. TSH targets the thyroid gland. ACTH targets the adrenal gland. Growth hormone targets individual cells as well as the liver. And when it targeted the liver, we produce insulin-like growth factors. And those did what the growth hormone does directly, promoted protein synthesis, lipolysis, gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, right? Lean body mass growth. This was cortisol in the pathway, mostly. This was T3 and T4, mostly. We didn't, and this was mammary gland. Right, so if you can follow those the way we just summarized them right here on this page, then you got lots you can talk about with respect to the endocrine system. Okay, and remember the communication between cells in the hypothalamus and cells in the pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland, was by circulation, right? Blood vessels. Lots of blood vessels. So we had releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones being delivered from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Everybody okay with that? Are we okay?
Yes.
So let's look, before we leave the pituitary gland, we should, I don't think we've really talked too much about the posterior pituitary gland. So that's anterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary, that was the part of the pituitary gland that stores two particular hormones. So we had neurons up in the hypothalamus that produced, let's do this, produced these hormones. So our turquoise ones are going to be the ones that end up producing oxytocin. And our yellow ones produce the other hormone, ADH. So oxytocin is a hormone. Did anybody do oxytocin as their project? I know
Yes,
yeah,
I did.
Okay, so can I put you on the spot? Do you want to answer some questions? Or
Okay.
we know, so for example, oxytocin targets smooth muscle in the uterus that promotes labor. Most of us are fairly comfortable with that one, right? And it's an example, labor is an example of a positive feedback loop. When there's a stretch on the uterus from the baby, and as long as there's a stretch on the uterus with a couple of other triggers that get things started, then the oxytocin will get released more and more, and the frequency and intensity of the contractions get more and more until there's no stretch. In other words, the baby gets born. Then that's when negative feedback kicks in and the oxytocin levels will go down. Does that sound reasonably what you found in your research?
Yes.
Okay, and it also targets some special muscle cells called myoepithelial cells in a mom's lactating breast tissue. And so the same concept applies. When the baby suckles, that's a signal for oxytocin to be released. And oxytocin will continue to be released as long as the baby's suckling, and that will promote ejection of milk, not production. This was production. Prolact production. Oxytocin was ejection of milk. So oxytocin has its primary responsibility associated with female on very specific times in a female's life. Lactating breast and birth. Those are big times. Now it's also associated with oxytocin levels will be elevated when we're feeling good, especially if we're feeling, feelings like love and comfort and relaxation, those sorts of things. And then in the male, it has a smaller role to play, but still a similar role in terms of promoting smooth muscle contractions and cycling. It's associated with ejaculation and those sorts of functions in a male. The research has been much greater in females. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as that goes. Anything you want to add before we move on with oxytocin?
It's also considered, it's also called a love hormone too, because what you said earlier about bonding. And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, they nickname it the love hormone.
Yeah.
And the another nickname I've seen for it is sometimes called the cuddling hormone, because that's what you feel like doing when you're close to somebody you care for, and the oxytocin is thought to be elevated in those situations. So sometimes it's called the cuddle hormone. But again, love hormone, cuddle hormone, those are not going to describe functions. Those little hints or little reminders are just to set you on the right track for what the function might be for that hormone. Okay, so if you're asked a short answer question about oxytocin and you tell me it's the love hormone, you need to go a little further. You need to explain a little more. Now, ADH. Anti-diuretic. Hormone. Also known as vaso, so again, something to do with blood vessels now, vasopressin. So if you had to guess vasopressin, do you think vasopressin would increase blood pressure or decrease blood pressure?
I think it would increase it.
I think it will increase.
Yes, I think you're both right. So very good. So because vasopressin is really another way of saying vasoconstriction. And we already know about vasoconstriction with aldosterone. So ADH is called the antidiuretic or vasopressin. Both of those names describe parts of the functions of these hormones. So in the case of antidiuretic, diuresis is water loss. And if it's an antidiuretic, it's going to prevent water loss. So if you're thinking about water loss, what organ or organ system do you think that we might be targeting?
Kidney?
Yeah, this is going to be another hormone associated with the kidney. So the receptors for ADH and they're called, they got a great name for what they do. They're called aquaporins. That's basically saying they're water holes. So in a scenario where we're trying to concentrate the urine or prevent water loss, we increase ADH. So the stimulus would be a water loss scenario. So dehydration would be your classic example. And again, the hypothalamus, which makes sense because remember where these are being produced up here in the hypothalamus. So ADH is going to be produced in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary gland. There's what we call osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. They measure the concentration of the blood. So the stimulus is low blood pressure, which means osmoreceptors get excited. And that stimulates the production of ADH in the hypothalamus. So ADH production but release is happening from the posterior pituitary gland. Targets kidney tubules. Now, I think we mentioned last week that one way that we can make hormones more effective is if we increase the amount of the hormone that's available, or we can increase the number of receptors that are available. And when we have low blood pressure, the hypothalamus stimulates the production of ADH and the release from the posterior pituitary gland to target the kidney tubules. And at the kidney tubules, we upregulate the aquaporins. So not only are we increasing ADH availability, we're increasing the numbers of receptors. So if we have upregulation plus the ADH, what we do is we increase reabsorption of water. These are water pores, there's more of them. We're going to get more reabsorption of water. And if we get more reabsorption of water, what happens to blood pressure?
More blood pressure.
That's right. And that's what we said was our original stimulus. Right? And we also know that this hormone also promotes vasoconstriction of blood vessels. So we also increase vasoconstriction of blood vessels, which also increases blood pressure. Two ways that we can do it. So here you can see that ADH is all about the water. Aldosterone was all about the minerals, and water followed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if we have low blood pressure in the system, and that's very dangerous, right? A problem with low blood pressure is we're not going to deliver oxygen and nutrients to all the cells and tissues in the body. So we're going to be in trouble. This is potentially life-threatening. So we have two major pathways that are going to respond to low blood pressure. The one pathway is the RAAS pathway. That results in an increase in aldosterone and an increase in angiotensin 2. That increased sodium reabsorption, water follows, increased blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 increased vasoconstriction of most blood vessels, increases blood pressure. ADH right? The low blood pressure measured by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. That's going to increase ADH production, and ADH production is going to stimulate an increase in water reabsorption. Increases blood pressure, and we know it does that as well. Whoops, let me take that arrow. That's in the wrong spot. We want this one there, and the increase in ADH is what stimulates that. So we see two distinct pathways that are going to respond to a decrease in blood pressure. You know what? This would probably be something, this would probably make a pretty good short answer question. If you catch my drift. Do you catch my drift?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so keep that in mind. Here's what, briefly describe two ways that you could correct blood pressure in using it like it would be an endocrine question, right? So there you go. You could probably give me another way that you could increase blood pressure that's not an endocrine pathway. Could anybody think of one? That might even be a better question. Let's There's another way. In the sympathetic nervous system, our blood pressure is going to go up because we increase the heart rate. We do lots of other things that contribute to increasing the blood pressure. So there's 3 different ways that we're going to respond to a stimulus of low blood pressure. Is everybody okay? Do you see it?
Sir,
Yeah.
the writing in the green, is that ADN or ADH?
Well,
Like
have we
for one of
talked
the
about
pathways.
ADN? Have we talked about ADN?
Yes,
We have.
or I don't know. Is
I'd
that
say
ADN? Okay, maybe it's me.
no, I don't. Well, no, I'm just saying, if we talked about ADN, don't make something up that's not there. We have
No,
never
no,
talked
no.
about something called ADN, not to my knowledge.
I think it's ADH. I think it's just me. Like
I
in my
think, well, I don't think it's just you. I think it's a good question. But
Oh, okay.
here's the logic behind it all, right? We've never talked about ADN, so there would be no reason to see an ADN in there.
Okay.
Sir,
I know my writing's terrible. Don't worry about that. So it's important to double check.
okay.
Okay.
Sorry,
But-
the aquaporins. Is it porins or poris?
Aquaporins, where,
RINS?
yeah, was
Okay.
that the previous slide?
No, it's on the slide too.
Here it is, right there.
NS. Okay, thank you.
INS, all right, INS. If you just call them water pores, that works too, but their fancier name is aquaporins. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the other hormones that are around. The 2 important ones we want to talk about are insulin and glucagon. So we'll take a break. We'll come back in 10 or 15 minutes.